Okay, this is video 1 of 2 this week. I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of this is going to be review for you guys, but I wanted to make sure and go through it just in case, make sure that you just kind of refresh your memory on stuff. So ecology is a study of connections in nature. It's the interaction between organisms. It's the interaction between organisms and their environment, or between each other, between different species. So if you look, this is stuff we've already talked about in biodiversity, but you look at the different levels of organization from one organism all the way up to a biosphere, and even within that, the different types of organization levels. Okay, so a population is a group in which members of a species interact. A community is populations living and interacting in an area of different species. And then an ecosystem is a community interacting with the physical environment. So when they're talking in relation to the physical environment, you're talking about an ecosystem. When you're talking about like a food web relationship, that would be a community. And then a population is a single species of a whole bunch of individuals that are interacting together. So for example, it's very common to have a population, separate populations of an individual species. So the example that comes to mind is orcas. Actually, there are 3 separate distinct populations of orcas. And one of them only eats fish, one of them only eats mammals, and one of them eats both. And so the different populations don't mix together, don't interbreed, don't talk to each other. It's like different social groups between humans. So those are separate populations, one species, but separate populations of that species. Okay, so the habitat is a space that it occupies. Like I said, none of this is really new. So the habitat is the place, the niche is the role. So that's the difference. The niche is how they fit into that space, whereas the habitat is the space itself. A generalist is a species that would be like an R-selected species that can eat a wide variety of foods. It has a lot of options for resources, has a lot of options for habitats, generally toward the bottom of the food chain. And then a specialist is something that has a very narrow space that it can occupy, very specific food requirements, very specific habitat requirements, generally at the top of the food chain. Okay, so the biosphere is the life support. That's all the physical layers: air, water, soil, minerals. Hopefully you guys remember producers, consumers, decomposers for the trophic levels. Remember there's, first consumer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, so on and so forth. Okay, so your basic food web, just to refresh: first trophic level is producers, second trophic level is primary consumers, that'd be the herbivores, whatever eats the plants. Secondary consumers are carnivores that eat the herbivores, and then the top consumers, the tertiary consumers, are the carnivores that are eating either other carnivores or other herbivores. And then the detritivores, technically a detritivore is a decomposer or a detritus feeder. So when you're talking about a decomposer, you can't really see that, can you? Okay, when you're talking about a decomposer, you're talking about bacteria as a decomposer. And then when you're talking about a detritivore, that's more generally thought to be like a worm, or why am I blanking on everything right now? An animal that will eat dead stuff but doesn't break down dead stuff. So hopefully that you guys understand the difference there. The worm is an animal that's eating dead material just like any other prey. So they're generally eating meat-based. So they're generally carnivorous detritivores. They're eating the dead animals. So like a buzzard would be a detritivore. They're eating dead stuff, but they're not breaking down the dead stuff. That's the bacteria that would be breaking down the dead stuff. So that's the difference there. Okay, so that's exactly what I just said, actually. Cool. Forgot this slide was there. So the decomposers recycle the nutrients. They're breaking down the dead stuff, and the detritivores are just eating the dead stuff. Okay, a quaternary consumer is a carnivore. It's an animal that feeds on tertiary consumers. These are obviously much more rare. Humans comes to mind. In some cases, we can look at other ecosystems, like a polar bear would be one, perhaps a wolf, or those really top key predators are quaternary consumers. So the food webs show the energy change, the nutrient change through an ecosystem, and what's lost from that ecosystem. So you can see up here, if we were to look at this, let's see, we would have, okay, so these would be all the detritivores. Oh, that's cool. Okay, so let's try this again. Sorry. Okay, so up here would be the detritivores. And then we'd have our, right here is our primary producer. And then our primary consumer are both of those. And then we've got our secondary consumers right here. Still secondary consumers. These are our tertiary consumers, our tertiary consumers, and these are our quaternary consumers. Makes sense? And the whale all the way down here is actually still in a, he'd be a secondary, or a primary consumer, I'm sorry, primary consumer. Okay, so you see the differences there. Okay, so the amount of biomass in an ecosystem is the organic matter of dry weight. So, and I should have changed this. Guys, please make sure you change this. Not just plants, of any living material. Okay, any living material. So biomass is any organic matter. How much by weight animals and plants do you have in an ecosystem? So that represents the stored chemical energy of that ecosystem. So the biomass represented by the net primary productivity is what's available as food. So only the primary productivity, only the plants, is what's making the food for the whole ecosystem. So the amount of food that they are making, or the amount that they are, is the amount of food that's available for the rest of the ecosystem. So that changes between ecosystems, and that's generally the limiting factor. So for example, again, if we go to an oceanic ecosystem, the plankton would be the primary producers, and so the net weight of plankton is our net PP. That's our basic biomass, and that's what has to support the whole rest of the food chain for the whole ocean. You could do the same thing if you're looking at a terrestrial environment. You could look at a grassland. Looking at the grasses would be that primary productivity. So the weight of all the grasses in that grassland, in that meadow, would be your NPP. It's a rate, so it's, over time. It has a time component to it. It's the rate at which they're using photosynthesis to make energy, to make and store energy, minus the rate that they use the energy that they make. So it's the energy they have. So the net primary productivity is the energy that they are making minus the energy that they use. And it generally decreases from the equator towards the poles because you have less sunlight, which means you have less primary productivity, which means you have smaller food chains. And that was, like I said before in the biodiversity notes, that was a generality for the biodiversity notes as well. I'm sorry, for the food chains, the biodiversity as well. Okay, so the trophic pyramids, again, this is nothing new. You know that you need a whole lot of primary producers to make just a couple of tertiary consumers, so you get less and less energy. You're losing about 90% each step up the food chain is the difference there. So that's the usable energy. Remember, the rest of that energy is lost to the environment. So the ecological efficiency is the percentage of usable energy. So again, that's a 10% rule. We're going to lose 90% to heat, 10% goes up to the next level. That's the biomass that's moving up. So if I have 10,000 joules of energy, 10,000 biomass worth of plants, I'm only going to have 1,000 biomass joules of primary consumers, and only 100 of the mice, and only 10, like one snake. Okay, so it has to go. You lose 90% of that. So if you're looking at this from a human standpoint, that means that it's actually more efficient for us from an energy standpoint to eat lower in the food chain. If we're eating plants, we can eat supposedly more plants and still consume less energy than if we were eating a secondary or even a primary consumer, because you have to take into account all the energy that went into creating that secondary consumers. So even though we're eating fewer fish, the energy that went into them is by far much more. Okay, if we're looking at populations. So this is, again, a review, and we even talked about this in biodiversity. A population is going to grow until they hit their carrying capacity. So when their competition for resources increases, when the resources are all used up and there are no more available, that's when that population is going to decline. So once they hit that imaginary line where they hit all the resources they can maintain because they're using the amount of resources that they have, if they go over that line called the carrying capacity, then they will not have enough resources and there will be a die-off. So this is called a J curve. It's an unlimited resource option. So I said the carrying capacity is the maximum population that a particular species. So for example, if we're looking at deer population here, this is the maximum population of deer that this habitat, this ecosystem can support. Okay, so looking at life versus non-living components, the abiotic factors, we know that that's non-living, that's the physical stuff, and so that's going to limit the distribution of a species. The availability of matter, the energy resources can limit the number of organisms. So we need to make sure there's energy available, we need to make sure that it's continuously available, we need to make sure that the physical factors are within that range of tolerance. So this shows it really well. So if you're looking at this, you've got the optimum range. This is temperature, so you've got this optimum range of temperature right here. This one they can tolerate it, but they're not really thrilled about it. Too high, too cold. And this one they won't tolerate. So there are no living animals. So this shows really well the physical characteristics. So fish will tolerate a temperature that is from, let's say, 5 degrees Celsius all the way to 25 degrees Celsius, and that's about it for this particular species. And that changes based on every individual species. Okay. So this is kind of the law of averages type concept. Limiting factor principle essentially says that you can have too much or too little. You have to have just the right amount, because if you have too much, they kind of get overwhelmed and they don't thrive. And if you have too little, they obviously don't thrive because there isn't enough of those resources. So you need to keep them at that optimum range, the tolerance that fits the best for them. Some examples there is floods versus drought. You know, too much or too little water, both of them is a bad thing. You want that just right amount of water. So a flood would have negative impacts, a drought would have negative impacts. They'd be different negative impacts, but they're still both looking at the availability of water in different ways. And then polar bears and ice, if there's too much ice, they can't find the prey, but not enough ice, they can't hunt effectively, and we'll look at that a little bit later. Okay, so predators generally go after the sick, the weak, the old, or the very young. So that essentially, that's survival of the fittest, right? That takes out the bad stuff and leaves the really healthy individuals to get stronger and to have more access to the stuff they need. If you're taking all your resources and putting it toward your sick individuals, that's not going to help you very much for the healthy individuals. The healthy individuals will end up getting sick. So this shows how everything kind of balances itself. You see where the blue one is the hare. So you see where the hare population is really high, and then the lynx population jumps up, which causes the hare population to decrease, which causes the lynx population to decrease, so the hare population jumps up again. So you see this up and down, the cyclic thing, where the predator is just off the prey because they're responding to that change. And so this type is called an S curve. So an unlimited growth, if you're looking at your graph, an unlimited growth would be a J curve. That's unlimited resources. S curve is right around the carrying capacity. So you have your carrying capacity right here. So whatever the case may be, in this case, we're looking at the lynx controlling the hare. So you have a lot of hare, and then there's too many lynx, the hare population drops off. Lynx population drops off, you have more hare coming back, and then back and forth. So this is called an S curve, population growth. And this is what's most common, is the S curve. So the suitable habitat is the primary problem for almost every species. Whenever we talk about increasing biodiversity in Earth as a whole, we're talking about providing more habitat. because we are using so much of the available habitat. So if you're looking at people, we have to look at our human population growth as well and how that's affecting it. Infectious disease has a negative impact on humans. Our technology has a positive impact on humans. So our population growth is by no means exempt to any of these population control issues. It's just kind of harder for us to see because it's harder for us to think objectively. But stuff like the Black Plague, stuff like yellow fever, all of those epidemics of disease caused large mortality rates in humans that did definitely impact the species. Now that's getting less and less over time, technically, because our technology is getting better, but it is still definitely having an impact. Okay, you guys have seen this over and over again already, nothing new there. So the changes in populations, excuse me, if you're looking at a density-dependent population, the stuff that will impact the amount of individuals in that population is how they're competing for resources, is what type of predation they have on them, is what type of disease, and what type of parasites are affecting them. For populations that doesn't matter how many individuals there are, what's the human presence, what's the influence, what's the degradation of the habitat, and then what are the abiotic factors, the temperature, the climate, the stuff like that would affect it. So essentially, the two differences here, this density, what they mean by density is they mean how is the population itself having an impact on itself. So if I have a high density population, then there's going to be more competition for resources, in which case that population will probably decline. So the density dependent, those are the characteristics that will be driven based on the more the individual, the greater the distance. Disease travels faster in crowded conditions where you have a high density, stuff like that. Okay. Sorry, this didn't update, so that's why we're skipping some of this stuff. So, succession. Succession is a concept where if you take an ecosystem down to bare rock, it's going to, over time, be returned to its original state. So it's going to have specific types of plant and animal species that come in over time, pretty basic ones to start, and then more and more complex, and this is called succession. So you have a successive amount of organisms returning to that environment. So primary succession, you start with bare rock. That's where you're starting, basically at the ground. And that's no soil, no nothing. So soil formation has to start first. So you're going to have lichen and moss. Those are pioneer species, which means they're the initial species to come to an area with no soil. They can grow on pretty much nothing. But as they start to come, they create soil because they die and decompose, and that creates a soil. That soil has nutrients in it. So primary succession is bare rock. You're starting with nothing. The pioneer species are the first ones to come in. They're the really basic ones, generally plants that come in. They start to create the soil. And then over time, you have this secondary succession. So secondary succession would be when you have soil already. So for example, a forest fire is a great example of a secondary succession in an ecosystem. So that forest fire takes down, kills everything, but you still have, it's secondary because you still have the soil. Okay, the soil is there, so it's not a primary succession. So then you start with the little small plants, annual plants that come year after year. Over time, you end up having perennial plants grow in, larger perennial plants, and more stuff turning into the hardwood, turning into the forests and stuff to go back. So that'd be the whole succession process. So these are the stages and the time periods it takes. You can see that it takes, for the initial stuff, pretty fast, but then for the final stages of succession, you have a couple hundred years at least. Secondary succession, like I talked about already, forest fires are your most common example of that. Same process. You have your pioneer species first, the first ones to come in, the intermediate species, and then climax community is that fully mature community high biodiversity, healthy for that ecosystem, and food chain has been restored. So a climax community would be a high-density ecosystem, long-lived plant-animal species, high biodiversity, very pretty looking to us, lots of plants, stuff like that. Okay, and we've already talked about K-selected and R-selected, but I just wanted to review them with you really fast. So you guys can look through the list there. You can look through the R-selected list as well. We've talked about these already, so let me know if you have any questions on that. And then this kind of summarizes your population dynamics chart. So you can see A would be your J curve, B would be your S curve, and E would be your carrying capacity. C and D are not really as common. That's a logistic growth and a linear growth, and they happen for a few species, so it is possible, but it's not something that we necessarily need to, or that we won't see commonly.